Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Anthony Lees. I'm the Construction Policy Manager with the Health and Safety Executive. Welcome to all of the people listening to this webinar, which is being hosted by IOSH from their headquarters in Leicester. I did a similar webinar just over a year ago, I think, which was well received, and IOSH have invited me back to present a second one now that the arrival of the CDM 2015 regulations is imminent. Firstly, I'm very grateful to IOSH for asking me back, and I'm grateful to everyone who's listening in for giving the time to do this. First and foremost, I'm a health and safety practitioner, and I think it's important to state that from the outset. Sometimes I may talk in somewhat theoretical terms, but I'm also well experienced in the practical and human side of health and safety at work. Improving health and safety for the construction industry has been at the forefront of my mind throughout the last few years of this process, and also that of my colleagues. This slide shows what I propose to talk about this afternoon. Many of you will have heard myself and other colleagues in HSE talk about CDM previously. We've spent a lot of time explaining why we're changing the regulations and what has shaped them to make them into the form that they're in today. The time is now right, I think, to look forward and to think about how everybody in the health and safety system can get the best out of these regulations. I'll start by briefly setting the scene and giving some context. I'll then speak very briefly about the key changes in the regulations. These should be familiar to most of you, so I won't dwell on those. I will talk more about competence, about domestic clients, also about the implications of the change of thresholds in the new regulations and the change in the coordination function. In doing that, what I will try to do is to debunk a couple of myths. I'll also try to give my own views on the role of health and safety professionals in embedding the regulations. I'll be very interested in hearing your views about how you think that can happen best. I'll then say a little bit about the supporting materials which HSE and others have developed in support of the regulations and the way forward, before finishing with my own personal views on what I think the challenges are to the industry in taking these regulations forward. So let's start with some context. Firstly, what I would say from the outset is that we need to be clear that CDM 2015 does two things. Firstly, it delivers some changes that we had to do because we have to comply with government policies on better regulation and because we have a clear obligation to remedy the way in which the UK transposes the directive behind CDM. Secondly, it delivers some other things that HSE believes are the right thing to do in terms of health and safety outcomes. In the former category, I would put the change to thresholds, the removal of the domestic client exemption in particular. In the latter category, I would suggest that what we are delivering with these regulations is real structural simplification. We're also shaking up how coordination is delivered and opening up the very detailed and complicated framework of competence under the existing regulations to a new approach. So my view is that the regulations are therefore a compromise, and I say that unashamedly. They deliver some things that we probably wouldn't have wanted to, such as the domestic client issue, but a compromise nonetheless. The regulations implement a directive which splits the entirety of the construction industry into two categories. Firstly, there are single contractor projects. So just think for a second what a single contractor project looks like. It's very, very small. They are very much in the minority. And then there's everything else, the rest of the industry. The fit, therefore, of the directive and the regulations that implement them is imperfect because it's a compromise. And I would invite you to consider where the fit is good and where it isn't good. I would suggest that if you take a typical medium-sized commercial construction project, maybe around the £1 to £2 million size, if an HSE inspector turns up to that project and asks to see the site manager, there will be an office, The site manager will have a desk with a phone and a computer. There'll be plans hanging in files. There'll be a Gantt chart on the wall behind him or her. If the inspector asks to see the construction phase plan, they will be able to produce a document. If they ask for the contact details for the CDM coordinator, the right bells will ring in the site manager's mind. I think CDM fits, and the directive behind it fits pretty well with the way that the industry is organised at that level. However, if you go to a much larger project, let's take HS2. Well, firstly, where's the site office? If the inspector turns up to the office, it's likely to be somewhere very corporate. There won't be a site manager. There won't be a construction phase plan. The CDM coordinator will not be an individual. It will be several organisations. And again, at the smallest end of the spectrum, a small domestic construction project, the concept of the construction phase plan and how coordination would be delivered does not fit well with the directive, but that's where we are. The challenge, therefore, is applying the regulations without losing sight of common sense. Many of you will have scenarios in mind, and I expect to hear about some of those, which can show that if you apply the regulations at the extremes, you may get some perverse outcomes. That's the reality of wide and open-ended legislation. Do I need a risk assessment for changing a light bulb? It's that sort of question. But there is an important point to remember here. It's still all about managing risk and managing it proportionately. Finally, I think we need to consider the needs of the industry. Emerging from recession is a tough job for construction, and history has shown that when the sector emerges from tough times, accident rates soar. The end of this recession is no exception. Add to this the problems that the industry has at the moment with labour and material supply chains. Taking all of this together, it's probably not a good time for these regulations for the industry. We also have to focus very much on the needs of small sites where the contribution towards the accident profile of the industry is still disproportionate. The final point I'd make in terms of setting the scene is that we're not changing the standards required in the regulations, nor are we changing the enforcement expectations for the way that HSE inspectors will work. So I will briefly talk about the changes that the regulations are bringing in. Firstly, and most significantly, the regulations are significantly simpler in structure than the CDM 2007 regulations. They read more like a storyboard from left to right. It starts with the client and the appointments, the bringing of a team together, moving into the construction phase, with Part 4 delivering the technical standards which the management arrangements in Parts 1 to 3 are designed to deliver. The regulations change the thresholds at which the more formalised level of duties kicks in. That's changed from the notification threshold, 30 days, 500 person days, down to wherever there is more than one contractor. And similarly, we've removed the exemption for owner-occupiers having work done on their own homes from being a construction client. Those changes, thresholds and domestic clients, are the ones which are required to comply with the directive. You will be aware that we are replacing the CDM coordinator role with the role of the principal designer. That's a very subtle but also very significant change. We want to see coordination seen much more as a business function than an individual role. We've also clarified the relationship between the pre-construction phase coordinator, the principal designer as it is now, and the principal contractor to make the two duties mirror each other and bring some symmetry in, so that the client is supported by a pair of principals working on their behalf. At the same time, however, we acknowledge that there is never a black and white line, or very rarely, between the pre-construction phase and the construction phase. So we've built in mechanisms that require the continued exchange of information and ideas between the two principals in the pre-construction and the construction phases. From my own point of view, the really important changes are the structural simplification and the clarification of the relationship between the two coordinators. Those are the ones that I think will have the most impact on the vast majority of construction projects. If we look at domestic client duties, I think there are some myths to be debunked there about what the implications will be, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. So, the delivery of coordination. Coordination should be at the heart of every construction project, in the pre-construction and the construction phases. And I'll just pause for a second to reflect something that I've heard when we've been speaking to construction industry stakeholders extensively over the last 18 months to 2 years. And what's emerged is a lack of understanding in my mind about what the CDM coordinator's role is. In many cases, and this is a misconception that exists within the minds of some CDM coordinators themselves, they see themselves as construction phase health and safety advisors. That's not their role. Their role primarily is to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate health and safety information in the pre-construction phase, which mirrors the role of the principal contractor, which we're not proposing to change very much. Coordination under CDM 2007, I don't think has been the success that it might have been. The reasons in my mind are the resourcing of the role, which in many cases is very poor, the individual skill sets that some CDM coordinators bring to the table, and the fact that people still persist in seeing coordination in the pre-construction phase as an externalized individual role rather than a business function. So the principal change that we want to see with the move to the principal designer is a move to better integration of pre-construction phase coordination. And I believe that will give rise to gains in efficiency and effectiveness of that role. For many projects, coordination in the pre-construction phase will be deliverable through the existing team. However, for some, it will be supplemented by external expertise. So it will still be possible for a principal designer to buy in additional health and safety advice as they see fit. Where that is the case, we expect that there will be appropriate governance internally in place to make sure that that role is delivered effectively. What we're trying to do is to shift the default position away from projects always seeing coordination as an external role and shifting it towards an internalized business function. Most building contractors are resourceful. They manage to hire and fire, they manage to get to the job on time, they manage to get the materials ordered and delivered. Why should it be seen as something separate that they should not be coordinating health and safety information in the early stages of the project? The message is most of the time this is something that can be done in-house. I'll now move on to say a little bit about competence. My starting point here is that I acknowledge that what HSE is doing with these regulations in terms of competence and removal of the detailed competence requirements under Regulation 4 and Appendix 4 of the existing regulations appears counterintuitive. How can HSE still support competence if we're removing the requirement and the word from the regulations? Well, the experience of 2007 showed that regulating for competence isn't the way forward. It has a number of unintended outcomes. In particular, it's very much driven the commercial third-party accreditation schemes, which in many cases add only an illusion of competence and add considerable cost onto the projects. And at the same time, it's supported the prolific growth of individual card schemes at the individual level, of which there are over 300 now in operation. So what we're doing is saying, look, we're trying to remove the detail here to allow the industry to have a grown-up debate about what it wants in terms of a competent workforce. What's lacking at the moment, I believe, is a shared vision for what competence actually means. In some cases, people think competence is about training. In other cases, people think it's about the piece of plastic that a worker carries. The debate needs to involve HSE, contractors, health and safety professionals, CITB and other training boards in the industry, professional bodies and government more widely, particularly in the context of the Government 2025 Strategy for Construction, which has put competence at its heart. So the industry needs to come together to develop a shared view of what competence means. And until there's consensus on what competent means, I believe that the industry won't break the cycle that it's in at the moment of chasing its tail over competence and wasting a vast amount of resource in trying to deliver it. I'll now move on to say a little bit about domestic clients. As I've said previously, CDM 2015 removes the exemption for owner-occupiers from being clients for the construction work that they procure on their own homes. Well, what does this mean in practice? Does HSE want to criticise Mrs. Miggins when she's having roof work done on her own home? Well, of course not. It's not on my moral compass to start prosecuting householders when work that they procure goes wrong. In the same way that I don't think HSE would want to prosecute people who take their car into the garage to be serviced when the garage doesn't do a good job. It's exactly the same analogy. It doesn't sit well with HSE's agenda. It doesn't sit well with health and safety professionals, and frankly, it's not a vote winner either. But because of the directive requirements, we had to change our regulations. So the way we've drafted CDM 2015 and the way that it applies to domestic clients, again, is a compromise. And it's a compromise between satisfying clear directive requirements and avoiding the worst excesses of applying regulations literally for the smallest pieces of construction work. So what we've done is we've transferred the client duties that would otherwise fall on Mrs. Miggins onto the one party who should know what they're doing on a project. That's the builder. And at the same time, we've placed the coordination requirements, to the extent that they do exist on such projects, on the people who are running the job, the person involved in design work and the person involved in doing the building. At the level of placing practical requirements on people to manage risks, I think it works. But we are aware in HSE of the need to prevent the mis-selling of services to householders, and we acknowledge that there is potentially a very big market for people to start going in and selling coordination services where they're not really needed in practice. We also need to be quite clear here that this does not mean that HSE is going in to prosecute householders. There are mechanisms under CDM 2007 which allow a householder, if they choose to control the construction work themselves, to be prosecuted. That provision remains in CDM 2015, and I can't conceive of many circumstances where we would want to pursue householders. Let's not forget that the people working on construction projects for householders are still contractors, and the duties that they have are fundamentally unchanged from CDM 2007. So, my thoughts about the role of health and safety professionals. The key message here is that there are a lot more of you than there are of HSE inspectors. So you see far more duty holders than HSE does. We therefore need you to deliver a message about proportionality of approach in these regulations. For well-managed projects, the message here is that the changes will be minimal. It's not about what the outcomes are, it's subtle but significant changes in how those outcomes are delivered. And unless we get health and safety professionals on board with the vision of CDM 2015, it will fail. So HSE is quite clear that we need to work with all of you, and with IOSH at the local and the national level, and with the other professional bodies, to make sure that the messages getting out there are clear. This is not a radical change for well-managed projects. It's a structural shift in the regulations and better integration of coordination and a new approach to competence. Some of you will be CDM coordinators. Some of you, therefore, will be in a position to discharge the principal designer role, and some won't. But what we do want to see is a general change of mindset towards coordination in the pre-construction phase, and we need all health and safety professionals to be clear about what that coordination function involves. It's not about being a site safety advisor, it's being somebody who plans, manages, monitors and coordinates health and safety information before the construction work begins. So it should be seen as a business function, not an individual role. I would really quite like to stress that point. Health and safety professionals are fundamentally important in delivering that message, and I look forward to continued work with IOSH and its members nationally, locally and indeed individually in developing those messages. I'll now turn to the supporting materials that HSE and others are producing in support of the regulations. The first thing I would say is that the removal of the approved code of practice has been probably the most controversial element from where I sit of the entire move to CDM 2015. You will be aware that when we consulted last year, we were proposing that there would not be an approved code of practice supporting the 2015 regulations. Around 3/4 of the people who responded to the consultation kicked back hard against that. I wasn't surprised that people did kick back. I was probably surprised by the strength of that kickback. We therefore secured agreement from the HSE board over the summer last year that there will be an approved code of practice supporting the 2015 regulations. It will, however, be significantly shorter, and it won't contain as much detail as the approved code of practice under the 2007 regulations. We will consult later on this year on the content of that ACOP, so please watch this space for developments on that front. We will therefore have a period where the regulations are not supported by an ACOP. What will fill the gap? Well, in the meantime, you'll probably be aware that we published what HSE refers to as its L series or legal series guidance in, I think it was on the 9th of January of this year, in draft form. On the same day that the CITB published the joint HSE industry guidance, again in draft. Now, the L series guidance is designed to provide authoritative interpretation of what the regulations require. The industry guidance, and there are 6 pieces of it aimed at the 5 duty holder groups plus workers, is designed to paint a picture of what good looks like. It is aimed at small sites. The question has been asked many times, what will fill the gap for larger projects? Our reply to that is, our focus is on small sites. We will support bodies that want to produce additional guidance to the extent that we can with the resources that we have in producing guidance that suits specific sector needs such as the rail industry. We are conscious of the need to fill the gap which might be exploited for those construction projects which are caught up in what I call the threshold shift. In other words, those projects for whom there is now the higher level of duties of coordination and particularly construction phase plans that previously fell below the notification threshold and therefore didn't have to deal with either of those issues. This is primarily smaller builders with little formalisation of approach. So HSE is producing, along with CITB, a number of different pieces of material and product to fill that gap. We're producing a leaflet for householders. We're also producing some smartphone apps. Most small builders have smartphones these days. To try to get people to think about what a construction phase plan, which is now required for all projects, looks like on the smallest of sites, and frankly to avoid the mis-selling of services where they're not needed. The CDM Wizard app, which is already available on Android in the Play Store and will be available hopefully within the next week or so on iOS, is a product which we think will be taken up in fairly significant numbers by small builders. It takes about 5 minutes to fill in. All it does is lead a builder through the thought processes of planning and sequencing a job. Now, it's not God's gift, but it does produce a construction phase plan that is specific to the circumstances, identifies what thought processes the builder may need to go through in terms of addressing the risks that arise on the project based on the information that they've put in. Now, we're realistic enough to know that not every builder is going to use that, only a small proportion will. But if a builder spends 10 minutes spending a bit of time thinking about the sequencing and planning of the work, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. We've shown it to small builders in the industry. They like it very much. Our inspectors like it. I would encourage you to go out and have a look at it yourself and provide feedback to us and to CITB. We've also produced a series of presentations which will be on the HSE website shortly. Some are aimed at HSE inspectors to pass on information to industry duty holders and stakeholders, but we're also producing a presentation for industry to give to industry through supply chains. That will be available on the HSE website as well. We also plan to work on further products to get messages out through IOSH in particular, and I think this will develop fairly quickly over the next 6 to 9 months. Briefly then, I will turn to my own view on what I think the challenges for the industry are in taking forward the CDM 2015 regulations. And this is a personal view. My first concern is embedding the idea of proportionality. One size doesn't fit all, whether we like it or not. And what we need to establish is a clear picture in duty holders' minds, particularly at the smallest end of the market, of what does good enough look like. Secondly, we need to oversee a new industry approach to competence. And I am concerned at the way that some of the discussions in the industry are going at the moment in terms of the lack of vision over what competence means. The industry will get the competent workforce that it wants, but it will have to develop the systems for assuring competence that suit its needs. At the moment, I don't think that those systems are in many cases fit for purpose, and to be fair, the industry acknowledges that. HSE's role here, I think, primarily is as a catalyst rather than a reagent itself. We've tried legislating for competence and I don't believe it's worked. What we need to do is to try to bring some oversight into the process of those industry discussions in developing this consistent view of what competent means. The third challenge, I think, is carrying professional bodies and health and safety professionals with us on that journey. And I think key to this is actually being honest about our motivation for changing CDM. And I've been honest with you today in saying that there are certain things we wouldn't have done if we'd had a free hand. And we need people to acknowledge that. Professional bodies, I think, have got a key role in developing internal systems and materials to support their members. One of the questions that's arisen frequently in the run-up to CDM 2015 is what will replace the competence requirements for CDM coordinators, because we're now moving to the principal designer. I think that there is a key role for professional bodies in developing a vision for what the key skill sets for principal designers will be. HSE will help them in that, but I don't think we can mandate them. Fourthly, I think there's a challenge in aligning the future health and safety agenda with the government strategy for construction. At the moment, I think there is a tension, if I'm honest, between what's a very clear growth agenda for the industry and health and safety. And I think that's come to prominence under the current government. There are also tensions around the strategy's approach to competence, which need to be resolved. And there's a wide degree of debate going on around that subject at the moment. So I think those are some but not all of the challenges facing the industry. I'm going to wind up at that point. Thank you all for your patience in listening and open this for questions. Thank you very much. I've just been asked to mention that there is a question box on the right-hand side of your screen, which I believe you can type questions into in case you haven't seen it. Thank you very much. Right, well, the questions are coming in thick and fast, so we're just allowing a little bit of time for those to build up. I'm going to try to answer questions which focus on the generality of what the regulations are trying to deliver, rather than on the minute detail. There is a time and a place for those questions, but I don't think this venue is the best place to answer them. The first question I will turn to is from Peter, who asks what the difference is between skills, knowledge, and for individuals training, and experience and organisational capability, between that and competence, other than omitting what Peter refers to as the C word. I use that term as well, Peter. Well, I would start by saying that competence is a problematic word for the reasons I've described, in that there is no one vision of what competence means. Nor is there any lower limit on it. You're either competent or you're not. There is no such thing as a little bit competent. What we've tried to do with CDM 2015 is to break competence down into its component parts. Some of them are inputs and some of them are outputs. So you can have the skills and knowledge about how to drive a 360 excavator, for example, but you may not have the experience to do it. Or you may have the experience and the skills, but not the knowledge of the site-specific issues that relate to the environment that you're working in. So at one level, there is no difference, but what we're trying to do is break down competence into its component parts that we think will lead people through the thought processes for understanding what competence means in a particular context. Right, the next question I will turn to is from Louise, who suggests that the APS, the Association for Project Safety, seems to be introducing a CDM advisor to the principal designer role. And she goes on to say, amongst other things, that this may just run the risk of maintaining the status quo, if I can paraphrase your question, Louise. What I would say is that there will be a role in certain situations for health and safety advice or process-based advice to be provided to the principal designer. As I said earlier in my presentation, we believe in HSE that in the majority of cases there will not be a need for that. So we will need to work with the APS to actually determine the parameters of where they see it as being appropriate for selling those services. What we do not expect to see is that it will be routine that people will need to buy in that advice. So the question that's been raised with me several times is this CDM coordinators by the back door? The answer to that is a resounding no, because somebody being brought in to provide that advice does not have the duties or indeed the authority of the principal designer. That role will sit with whoever is appointed as the principal designer. So it's a subtle but significant shift. Just bear with me for one moment while I read through some of these questions. There's a lot of detail in these. I will now turn to a question from Jerome, if I pronounce that correctly. My apologies if not, who has raised a question regarding the transitional provisions. And the question is, for existing projects, either pre-construction or on site, which have more than 6 months to run, do these need to change their CDM appointments to reflect the new regulations? In other words, the appointment of the PD or the CDM coordinator. Well, the answer in terms of the principal designer is no, they don't, because somebody who's been appointed as a principal designer, a principal contractor under the CDM 2007 regulations will be allowed to continue as a principal contractor. However, at the end of the 6-month transitional period, if the construction project has not finished, then there will need to be appointments as soon as practicable of a principal designer. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarity on that element in the transitional provisions. I will turn to a question from Ken, very straightforward one. Will the apps be free of charge? Very straightforward answer, absolutely. I'm now going to turn to a question from Alan, who says, without enforcement, how will the smaller domestic contractor be driven to change? Well, the answer to that is not simple. In many cases, small contractors are very hard to reach. The issues that you raise here are not new to CDM 2015. They exist under CDM 2007. The key point here is that we're not expecting domestic contractors working for small domestic projects to do anything fundamentally different from what they're doing at the moment if they are actually complying with the law as it stands at the moment. So enforcement has its role. We're not saying that we're not going to enforce against contractors working on domestic projects. If you look at HSE's enforcement profile, you will see that a very significant proportion of enforcement is taken against contractors working on small projects. So the answer to that question is there's really no change in the current position or from the current position. I'm going to turn to a question from William now, who asks about the new notification threshold. I didn't cover this in my earlier presentation, but I'm happy to turn to it. The notification threshold under CDM 2007, as you will be aware, is that the project is notifiable if it's expected to last for 30 days or 500 person days worth of resource. Under the new regulations, that will change again to align the thresholds with the directive. What the directive says is not 30 days or 500 person days, but says 30 days and 20 workers simultaneously at any time, or 500 person days. So what it will mean is that fewer projects will be notifiable because of those that were previously notifiable having fallen under the 30-day category, only a subset of those projects will also be expected to have 20 workers working simultaneously at any point during the project. The implication for that will be that HSE expects that the number of notifications required will be reduced by a factor of around 2. And it's worth mentioning concerns that we've heard about the loss of intelligence to HSE about the projects that we want to be able to see. Well, the first point I would make in response to that is that a large proportion of the projects that we inspect proactively at the moment are not currently notifiable because they are for domestic clients. And secondly, I would make the point that HSE only inspects around 6% of the projects that are notified by F10 to them. So I wouldn't want to overplay the implications of the reduction in the notification threshold. I'm going to turn to John's question now, who says that a huge section of the domestic market is going to be unaware of the CDM regulations. It sounds like HSE are simply going to accept this. Would this be a fair assessment? In reply to that, I'd say that we have to be pragmatic. We need to focus on the people who are creating the risk and their duties for managing that risk. And fundamentally, that has not changed from CDM 2007. The fact that an owner-occupier assumes client duties which are transferred onto the builder does not change the fact that that builder is still a contractor under CDM 2015 as they were under CDM 2007. And the safeguards that they have to deliver have not changed. So I think it's a trap to avoid falling into to focus too closely on changes to the domestic market, where all we're really asking people to do is to continue to manage risk proportionately. That does require that there is a degree of coordination carried out, but I would invite people to consider what coordination looks like on a small £20,000 domestic project. I would argue that it requires little more than is currently delivered on a well-managed project. I'm going to turn to a question from James, which is an interesting point, who says, is there an industry standard template for the PC, HSP and the construction phase plan? Well, turning to the construction phase plan, HSE is producing a template for the domestic market. The reason being that we want to try to plug the gap before consultants plug it for us. So there is, running in parallel with the smartphone app, which unfortunately, to answer another question, is not at the moment going to be available on Windows, but that's a conversation we can have with the CITB. We have a very brief construction phase plan for domestic projects that effectively allows people to fill in on paper the same sort of information that they would fill in on the smartphone app. Other than that, I think there are dangers in producing any sort of standard template for a plan because all projects are different. Right, we only have time to reply to one or two further questions, so I'll take one very quick one from Sue, who just asks for clarification about the transitional arrangements. I think the important point about the transitional arrangements is that there is a good legal reason why the schedule to the regulations that contains the detail of those is rather complicated. However, there is a very clear take-home message. The transitional provisions effectively only cover the transition between the CDM coordinator and the principal designer role. If you're a principal contractor and you've been appointed under CDM 2007, you will continue to be accepted as a PC under 2015. What the transitional provisions allow for is a 6-month run-off period for people who are already appointed in projects that have started on the 6th of April in the construction phase to continue to effectively operate as CDMCs for a period of up to 6 months or until the end of the project, whichever comes sooner. That really is the only message that you need to worry about in terms of the transitional provisions. The final question I will reply to is one from Kath, which I think is an important one. So apologies for not picking that up earlier. And the question is that it seems that architects are going to be asked to take on the PD role, but that role was taken on by CDM coordinators who were specifically trained. This seems like it will leave architects vulnerable, in other words, taking on extra responsibilities that they're not trained for. Well, I agree up to a point, but every project is different, and I believe that an architect working as part of a project team should have access within that team to the skills to coordinate health and safety information in the pre-construction phase. Health and safety should form part of an architect's training, and there are big questions around the degree to which that does or doesn't happen consistently around the country in the 40+ schools of architecture. That's something that HSE is working very closely with the professional bodies for. I would say two other things by way of response. Firstly, we would expect that schools of architecture in the future do deliver better and more on the way that they train architects for health and safety. And secondly, a principal designer does not have to be an architect. A principal designer has to be a designer who is in a position of control in the pre-construction phase. When we say designer, people sometimes think that is architect, but what we're talking about is somebody who is a designer within the meaning of the CDM regulations. And just one final point is just to refer back to something I said earlier, there is nothing to stop somebody who needs specific health and safety advice in the pre-construction phase from buying that resource in. That does not make that person the principal designer, however. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I've been asked to point out to you that this session has been recorded and will be available on the IOSH website in due course. And a link will be sent out to it and a thank you email to all of those who've registered tomorrow. So thank you very much for listening in. Signing off from Leicester. Good afternoon.